Smash! Another Department of Justice complaint. This time it's a North Korean individual charged with involvement in the Sony Entertainment attacks, WannaCry, and a litany of attempted bank heists, all done through a front company for the North Korean government, Chosun Expo. Our own Chosun experts, Richard Gold and Raphael, join me, Michael Marriott, to discuss the implications of the DOJ complaint and what it all means for organisations. Happy Friday, Podsters. So just when it was looking like a quiet week in InfoSec, boom, yesterday this Department of Justice criminal complaint was unsealed from a couple of months ago against an individual accused for working for the front of the North Korean government that's deemed responsible for a staggering number of attacks. We might know this group better as Lazarus Group. They've been accused of a lot of different things. So there's the bank heist, the 81 million from Bangladesh, also attacks in Philippines, African, Southeast Asian and Vietnamese banks. WannaCry, defense company attacks, Sony Entertainment, currency exchanges, South America, and I've still probably missed a bunch of these. But here to discuss these, we've got our head of security engineering, Dr. Richard Gold, and our research and strategy supremo, Raphael Amado. Hi, chaps. How are you doing?
Hi, Mike. Very well, thanks.
Hey, Mike. Yeah, as you said, I was getting all geared up for a nice relaxed Friday going into the weekend, and then this came online yesterday. But it's been very interesting, and it's good material for us to discuss today.
Yeah, I hope you've both had a chance to leaf through the 170 odd pages of the document.
It's just a brief skim. Yeah, brief read on the way to work this morning.
Yeah, it's obviously very interesting in general. So I want to pick through the best bits and hopefully draw out the most relevant bits for organizations. There's lots of overlapping aliases and infrastructure linking all of these campaigns together. But I want to talk about one common thread throughout all of these, and that was the Bramble malware that we used as hot points by the group. Do we want to talk about that, what exactly it was doing and how it enabled their operations?
Yeah, it's a really interesting piece for this indictment. I thought it was a real eye-opener. So effectively, these guys had a worm, so a self-replicating autonomous bit of software that would crawl around the internet looking for SMB, so Windows file share, looking for SMB servers and attempt to brute force them. Now, when it succeeded, it would get on board, get onto the machine. It would then email the credentials and the host name and maybe other information back to the attackers they used a bunch of different Gmail accounts and just then self-replicate on that machine and then move throughout the internet looking for new targets. So this was quite a brilliant move, in my opinion, for the attackers just to always have a continuous, freshly updated selection of machines which they used as hot points, so relays to obscure their traffic as they went about their nefarious deeds.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't always that information that they used to perform the attacks, though. They mixed that up with using proxies and sometimes none of that at all.
Yeah. So they were quite happy to use proxy services where appropriate and sometimes actually not using anything at all, which is also probably how they got picked up. The North Korean IP address space is pretty small, so anything coming from that space is definitely going to be of interest.
So Rich, what was also, I think we discussed it a bit earlier, was also interesting from that particular malware, the way it was collecting things is we've been talking a lot recently about MITRE ATT&CK and the techniques used and how the different stages marry up. And you made the point earlier how you talk a lot about how attack and pre-attack might have a relationship. And in this case, you see how the attack part of one particular stage of the attack can then basically be the reconnaissance phase or the pre-attack phase of a different one.
Absolutely. And you can see with this Bramble worm that it's basically its own fully self-contained attack cycle in some sense. And that feeds perfectly into the pre-attack phase, the reconnaissance phase of many other attacks which we've seen. It helps them set up their infrastructure, gets them prepared for whatever attack they want to conduct later on.
So the fact that sometimes it came from North Korean IP addresses, is just one of the OPSEC mistakes, which are always interesting in these types of indictments. And a few others mentioned in the report included the testing of spear phishing campaigns themselves to email addresses that had commonality throughout a variety of the different campaigns.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, right? Because OPSEC for me is something which is, it has a value when there are going to be negative consequences attached to them, or attached to the OPSEC failures, is what I mean. So for example, in this case, what are the OPSEC failures for this guy or these group of attackers? They are probably pretty minimal, the consequences that these people will face. It's not like this person's likely to be extradited as far as we know. So they, of course, they are mistakes, but also at the same time, they're fairly appropriate for this kind of actor. And that is an actor where they anticipate there will be effectively zero legal consequences to their actions. So taking OPSEC incredibly seriously and being incredibly diligent about it is kind of a waste of time for these guys. And it's such a difficult and tricky and complicated process and so hard to get right. And you have to be so consistent all the time that I'm not surprised actually that they just went, yeah, we just really don't care because nothing is going to happen to us.
As well as that, I'd say this also sort of reveals something about how this group might be structured and the way they operate. So they've got their infrastructure set up. They've got all the different accounts they're using for spear phishing, their social media accounts that they're using as well. It seems like they're probably sharing those accounts between users as well. So you have just a central pool of these different accounts that you use, and you use them across different campaigns. You have different people logging on at different times and using it for different purposes. Whereas sometimes we see attacks where it's just an individual attacker will just use one particular account for one particular campaign, and then that infrastructure they'll burn and they'll move on to something else. That's not what they're doing here. And that goes back to Rich's point. It's probably because they don't fear any of the consequences from doing that. It's just easier to reuse what they have set up already.
Absolutely. They have most likely limited timescales for the operations that they're conducting. They have different objectives that will have been set by whoever is steering them, whoever is controlling them. And so, yeah, they'll just do what they need to do to get the job done. And in terms of self-protection, if there aren't really consequences to being burned like this, then yeah, why would they care?
I was initially quite confused about, well, how hard is it to set up another Gmail account? But then kind of viewing these as distinct campaigns, is that a useful way of looking at it? Like if we look at the timeline outlined in the indictment, it was a pretty fluid transition from one target to the next.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think exactly that I mean, you've got a lot of stuff which is going on, a lot of things which are happening at the same time. Yeah, of course, it's not a lot of effort to set up a new Gmail account, but then that's another set of credentials that you have to manage. That's something, more information you have to keep. There's more things you have to know about, more things you have to share. And again, if it's not necessary, why would you do it?
One thing that I would argue would be necessary is they had quite similar or the same passwords for a lot of the tools that they were using, which surprised me. But yeah, point in general taken on OPSEC.
The cobbler's children have no shoes, as the saying goes.
As a man from Northampton, I'm insulted by that. Let's talk about spear phishing, because that was a common thing throughout the criminal complaint. And there are a few fascinating techniques that were used as part of that. And I think we can learn a fair bit from that. Any particular campaigns that stood out to any of you?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that there was a spear phishing campaign where they really attempted to impersonate somebody who existed. So they took a company that was legitimate, an employee that was working there, and they impersonated this person. I mean, that's a pretty good approach to sort of sail past somebody's defenses when it comes to the social engineering side of things. So they would probably be less likely, the recipient would be less likely to be suspicious if it's coming from an organization that they know and a legitimate employee. So that was pretty interesting. Another one I thought that was quite cool was the repurposing of security notifications from Facebook and Gmail.
Yeah, that was cool.
Yeah, so this is a pretty nice approach. So again, when people get these kind of security notifications in their email that there's been attempted unauthorized access to their account and this kind of thing, they're probably going to be a bit nervous, a bit confused, a bit upset. And that's a time when you're probably going to be less likely to be carefully scrutinizing all the different parts of the email to look for that malicious URL hiding in the background.
Yeah, that's the one that really caught my eye as well. Those ones using popular services like Facebook and Google Drive. So kind of like what Rich said, what they did here was they copied legitimate emails nearly in their entirety when they created their own spear phishing emails. And all they did was they replaced the hyperlinks in these emails with ones that redirected to the infrastructure that was under their control, probably to deliver malware. And as Rich said, you can see very easily why so many people would fall for something like this. They did the same with Google, with Gmail, with Google Drive messages, inviting people to view a document or to collaborate. So yeah, I think the fact that they're using these popular services, they're spoofing them almost exactly. They're just changing a few things. They changed the name of the name associated with the email address. So the email address wouldn't be a Facebook one, but they just changed the name. So at first glance, you would see it and it would just say Facebook notification. And obviously you can see why that would work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another interesting part from the indictment is the fact that they were quite happy to also use services like LinkedIn and others, Facebook, to conduct spear phishing. So it's not just email. They were posting links to on Facebook. They were sending LinkedIn messages to different people, and we've seen a common theme with them masquerading as people looking for work. So they provide a link to a resume. They would use URL shorteners to obfuscate what the link was pointing to ultimately. And they would use this to conduct their attack. And it seems to have worked. I mean, there was a case, for example, in the indictment, they reference Lockheed Martin, where it seems that the attackers were not successful, but in many cases that they were successful. And all they did was use a URL shortener to point to a malicious executable. So it wasn't really incredibly advanced in terms of its technical sophistication, but it clearly worked.
Yeah, one of the things I was particularly surprised at is, I know we shouldn't hate on people accidentally clicking on things, but the promise of nude pictures of celebrities in a Facebook campaign, I think with Sony, surprised me. I mean, who clicks on that type of message?
That's Hollywood, Mike.
Yeah. I guess underlying all of this is a fantastic effort at reconnaissance and the detailed knowledge that the attackers clearly had on the targets. And we saw that not only with the spear phishing campaigns, but also with the malware itself. And I think within the Sony Entertainment attack, the malware was pretty customized to the specific network.
Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, there were 10,000 host names hard-coded into the malware. So the attackers had clearly spent a bit of time both inside and outside of the network to figure out what the targets were going to be. And it also had some code for Linux systems as well as Windows. So they knew that the environment they were looking at was heterogeneous in that aspect. Yeah, they spent a lot of time on reconnaissance. They clearly were pretty dedicated to finding out a lot of information about their targets, about the way that they were organized, the way that their personnel and employees worked, and what technical information they could gather. So, what software was being used and this kind of thing. So they were, pretty nifty on that kind of stuff.
So on that, relating to the 10,000 individual sort of workstations that were hard coded, I think that's one side of the spectrum in terms of this reconnaissance. That's like really highly customized, sophisticated reconnaissance there, where they're probably sitting within the networks at Sony Pictures Entertainment for a long time and being able to perform all this type of collection and get this information. But then on the other hand, they're doing open source collection as well. I mean, the indictment details researching the victim company and employees just purely by going on their websites, and using services that specialize in locating email addresses associated with a domain or a company, registering for business record search services, career posts, marketing services, business searches. So these are things that obviously maybe a less sophisticated actor could do as well. So you've got, on the one hand, sitting within a network, being there for a long time, getting as much info as you need to then perform your attack, and then the stuff that you can do on open sources as well.
Yeah, absolutely. They were quite happy to use everything that they could get their hands on. And obviously the OSINT stuff is more available to actors who are operating in the kind of environment that these guys were operating in. It sounds like they were in a border town between North Korea and China. So they're operating maybe quasi-independently. So perhaps not having access to the same kind of resources that other nation-state actors would have had. So that's quite interesting in itself. And I think as well as the kind of technical information about the network, if we look at the SWIFT bank heists, they clearly spent a lot of time getting to know how the SWIFT network worked. And in particular, that they had malware which could make these fraudulent transactions. So it's not enough just to create the transaction and sign or authorize the transaction, but also the software that's used to do this makes a receipt. Now, in some cases, they mention in the indictment that the receipts are printed out, and other times they mentioned in other software, the software creates a PDF of the receipt. And this is a piece which I thought was particularly interesting, just to show the attention to detail that these guys had. So when the receipt was created, the PDF was created, the employees would typically use a piece of software called Foxit Reader, legitimate piece of software, and was not compromised by the attackers. So they'd use Foxit Reader to view the receipts. Now, the attackers had configured the machine in such a way that when Foxit Reader was opened, the malware would be triggered and check to see if the PDF that's being opened was a receipt, and it was a receipt that was one of the ones that had been created by the attackers. So if that was the case, then the malware would edit the PDF so it would appear to be benign, so it wouldn't look like a fraudulent transaction had been made. And then Foxit Reader would open normally, display the modified PDF, and the employees would be none the wiser. And this is really something which is quite spooky, in my opinion. So they're not only just going after like technical vulnerabilities or technical issues. So, WannaCry, they use the Shadow Broker's Eternal Blue exploit, which stolen from the NSA, of course. And, they did that piece, which is, we've seen that kind of work done elsewhere as well. But this kind of targeting of the business processes and spending a lot of time and obviously a lot of effort to build this malware, which is interfering with the business processes, shows that these actors are quite capable of pulling off quite sophisticated heists.
Yeah, in terms of return on investment as well, what was it? The Bangladesh one was 100 million and 81 million is still pretty much unrecovered.
Not bad.
Pretty impressive. Other things that were notable, I think, within the SWIFT reporting that has been the cause for some debate, I know, at Digital Shadows, with the use of the fake TLS protocol.
This is an interesting one. So we're having a bit of a discussion in the team, and we weren't quite sure what was going on with that. So basically, the malware would use port 443 for its command and control. Port 443 typically associated with TLS/SSL. That's all fine, but it was using a particular version of it, like its own binary protocol, which mimicked TLS, but was not actually TLS, actually used its own encryption method. So we were wondering if it was a way to bypass SSL interception systems. On the other hand, SSL interception systems would most likely fail closed, hopefully, depending on how they've been configured. If traffic is passed through, which is is not possible to inspect by the appliance. So why would you do it and have your own binary protocol for doing this, and obviously spend a bit of work doing that rather than just using TLS? Because if port 443 is enabled externally, then just TLS encrypt and you're good. So yeah, we're a bit unsure what exactly the purpose was behind that. It's not explicitly mentioned in the indictment. And yeah, we have a few alternative hypotheses, but it's an interesting one.
Yeah, I guess the silver lining on this, if you can call it that, is that there were many other attempted attacks against other financial institutions that were unsuccessful.
Right.
But I think for me, it's quite interesting often with these nation state actors that you may have a criminal group operating for them that may occasionally have financial motivations. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's fairly unique to have one that alongside kind of geopolitical and ideological interests is a primary motivation.
Yeah, it's interesting. They're kind of knocking over banks, virtual currency exchanges, all this kind of stuff, classic cyber criminal activity, as well as going after companies that make films that they don't like.
Yeah, I think, I guess we can emphasize that it's a cyber criminal complaint by the Department of Justice. So if that ties into it.
Well, we've seen with the with other indictments as well that there's been a criminal complaint against nation-state actors. The PLA indictment is another one, for example. So it does absolutely happen.
One other thing that stood out to me about this particular indictment was the intersection with the kind of online criminal forum scene that was demonstrated, particularly with the targeting of, I think, Lockheed Martin and other defense contractors. And the jaw-dropping moment for me was reading that some of these aliases are active on hack forums looking for exploits, which surprised me somewhat.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing with that is, well, I guess in some sense it's also not too surprising, because criminal forums are probably a great place to go if you are doing, well, committing crimes, for example, but also that if you're a nation state who wants to maintain a low profile, probably if you're going to go there and ask for help, people aren't going to ask too many questions of who you are, where you come from, what are you up to, all that kind of stuff. So it's probably not a bad place to do a bit of research and try and figure out, why your exploits aren't working.
Getting the latest zero days from hack forums, really? Oh.
It wasn't just that they were looking for. I mean, some of the other things they were requesting were like a silent document exploit, sample phishing emails, so it doesn't go to spam directly. And then, the other side of that was looking for vulnerabilities and exploits.
Well, they're also quite happy to take proof of concept code from existing security places, legitimate security companies. So they're clearly keeping up to date with what's going on in the wider community, and using that to their advantage too.
That part was actually really interesting for me. So that's, I think, more specific to the WannaCry campaign.
Right.
If you just look at the sort of timeline on that, so there were other versions of WannaCry before the last one, which is the one that became really famous because it affected over 100 different countries around the world, and big impact on the National Health Service in the UK, for example. So the exploit was released on the 15th of April, and then the attack occurred on the 12th of May. So that's less than a month. And it seems that they just basically built on the previous versions that they had. And as soon as they were monitoring and waiting for something like that exploit to come out. And then once the security company released the exploit code publicly on the 9th of May, that was then incorporated very quickly. And then about 3 days later, we saw the actual WannaCry attack itself.
Yeah, they are clearly pretty flexible. They are pretty agile when they're very opportunistic. So when something comes out which is of interest to them, and they weren't the only ones, right? We saw lots of people taking advantage of Eternal Blue once it became well known. It was such a powerful exploit, remote system over the network, worked everywhere, was very reliable, had everything that everybody wanted. And lots of criminal actors were very hot to take advantage of that. We saw the same thing, by the way, with the Hacking Team breach and the Flash O-Day that was pulled out of that. soon as they were discovered, attackers were putting them into exploit kits and exploiting targets very, very quickly. Sometimes I think even like that same day, like in a 24-hour period.
Yeah, and obviously there are online stores where you can download exploits for these vulnerabilities, and one of them is zeroday.today. And if you look at the Twitter handle of the individual indicted as part of this particular complaint, if you look at the archive tweets, you see him retweeting updates from 0 Day Today and folks involved with that. So clearly very interested to get hold of the latest exploits.
Certainly, although you see as well that the most success they had with all of the spear phishing that they didn't use any exploits. It was just social engineering.
Yeah, that's a reminder. And on that note, I guess it'd be good to talk about what we can learn for organizations about all of these different campaigns. What are the nuggets in here that we can draw out? And kind of in the same way that I know, Rich, you've done with mapping it to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Like, what can we learn from these that can help us better secure our companies? A great example of this is the hot points used by the as part of the Bramble malware campaign, and the fact that you may not be the initial target for this, but your infrastructure could be used to use as a hot point to conduct further attacks.
Yeah, I mean, certainly from the spear phishing side of things, there's filtering out what kind of attachments can be sent via email, I think is a pretty valuable one. We've seen in our research the usage of archives and archive file types, zip, gz, but also kind of weird ones like ARJ and zoo and others to spread malware. And that's so blocking those, if you don't think that that's something that you need to use for your business, then I think that's a pretty effective way of protecting people from at least that very specific approach. And I guess as well, the interesting thing was the fact that they were quite happy to drop executables onto the machine via the user clicking on a link. And so then again, of course, the user has to interact to actually run the exe. So some kind of application whitelisting or some kind of control over what happens when an executable is downloaded from the internet. Having visibility into that is also, I think, really important.
Yeah. And one thing I would add is that if clearly these actors are looking for the latest exploits of vulnerabilities, so in terms of prioritizing your patching, understanding when they become exploits in order to do something about it is significant.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing, I think, with the exploit, with Eternal Blue, I think Eternal Blue is a bit of an unusual one. So normally we see exploits against browser plugins. We see exploits against Office applications, Microsoft Office, Adobe Reader, this kind of thing, or content management systems like WordPress or Joomla, these kind of things. Eternal Blue as a remote system exploit in Windows is quite an outlier. So, if you go back to like MSO867, that's similar kind of thing. So these things don't usually come along too regularly. So, and the fact that it was, the exploit was out there, was working, was so reliable, I think was, that was a sign that it was something that's going to be really, really attractive to attackers and would be quickly exploited in the wild. So definitely something worth paying attention to. But as I say, that type of an exploit, Windows, remote Windows system exploit, that's an unusual one.
Yeah. Raphael, any key takeaways for you on this indictment?
I mean, we mentioned spear phishing, but that's the main thing for me that comes out of this. Is what I was most interested in. And it's not new, but once again, we've got another indictment like this, which is really bringing home how significant a tactic spear phishing and social engineering are. Like Rich said, a lot of the times, most sophisticated actors aren't even using exploits or 0 days. So you may get tired of hearing about the need to train your employees to spot phishing emails, employing good OPSEC across your organization, but there is a reason for it. Humans make mistakes, and this is still one of the best entry points into a network for an attacker.
Yeah, I think it's worth keeping in mind that you also should be, your network should be set up in such a way that if a user clicks on a link that they shouldn't do, that it's not the end of the world. So I think that's something which is worth taking on board, that defense in depth approach to have multiple partially overlapping security controls, not just technical controls, but also administrative procedural controls to ensure that, a failure in one case that, for example, the user is socially engineered does not end up with a full, network compromise. So that is why, things like application whitelisting, dealing with things like Windows script hosting and other scripting languages, PowerShell constrained language mode, these kind of things are useful for reducing that attack surface.
Of course, you can't just solely rely on your employees. Listening to the training and doing the right thing. There will always be human error, so you definitely need that blend of physical and security controls there as well. One idea I had was, how about taking some of these examples from the indictment and actually showing them to people in your organization as well? Because people might get tired of hearing all this sort of advice, but then if you actually show them, look, you've got sophisticated actors here, nation state actors using impersonating Facebook and Google Drive, or using LinkedIn messages directly to target people. These are real world examples that you can use as evidence to be like, look, this is actually what a spear phishing email might look like. And that would make it a bit more effective, I think.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I do like that as well. I think you make a good point that it can be quite abstract sometimes. You tell people, oh, threat actors create, convincing emails that make you click on stuff, and like, well, okay, great. But when you show it, like, the Podesta one, I think from APT28 is a really great and powerful example that really makes people, want to pay attention. But it's very difficult. I mean, the whole thing is these things work because they catch you at a moment when you're weak, and that can happen to anybody. That can happen to anybody. You're tired, you've didn't have your coffee that morning, you're nervous or upset, or there's something which is affecting your mood, or you're under time pressure, or anything like this can cause you to make a mistake.
Absolutely. I think that is all we have time for, unless anybody has any final points.
I'm good.
Nothing from me.
Excellent. Now, we talked a little bit about mitigation, but Richard, I understand in the trusted format, you may have maybe writing a blog on mapping this to the MITRE ATT&CK framework early next week.
It has been known to happen.
Hey, listeners, stay tuned for that blog and do give it a read. But thank you so much for listening. Thank you for joining me on this podcast, Richard, and thank you, Raphael.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
Thank you, Mike.
Have a great week.